Hi friends, Tony here from TL Yarn Crafts. When I'm not filming YouTube tutorials, you can find me either crocheting or taking pretty pictures of my makes to share on social media. To keep my photos interesting, I use different backdrops. Today I'm sharing this DIY knit look backdrop that I made. You don't need any knitting skills at all, just a specific yarn and a few hours of free time. If you'd like to give it a try, stay tuned. If you're excited for today's tutorial, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my new videos. For our knit look photo backdrop, we're going to need 4 balls of Bernat Alize EZ wool. This is a wool blend loop yarn that I found at my local JOANN store. It comes in several different colors and you can find it in store or at joann.com. I've linked directly to it in the description below. If you're allergic to wool or prefer a different look for your backdrop, I've linked to a similar loop yarn that should work just as well. I've also got a link below to my loop yarn review and a basics tutorial. If you're unfamiliar with anything I mentioned here or don't know much about loop yarn, you might want to start there. To start our project, we're going to take the label off of one of our balls of yarn and we're going to look for the end of the yarn. You'll want to find the end that's on the outside of the ball. There's no use looking for the end that's on the inside. You're just going to end up with a mess. Lay your strand of loops so that the beginning of your yarn is to your left side as I've shown here. Now you'll want to find your first 2 loops and we'll cut those loops open because those will become our end to weave in. So there's a little string that's connecting your loops. Just cut that string on the first 2 loops only, just like this, very gently. Now we'll want to count out 24 loops from the left. So there's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now I want to bring our working yarn around and we want to grab the next loop on our working yarn and push it from back to front through our 24th loop, just like this. And that's our first stitch completed. Now bring the next loop through the next loop on our foundation, just like that. Next loop from the working yarn through the next loop on our foundation, like so. And we'll want to repeat that all the way down. Now this foundation row can be a little bit fiddly, so definitely take your time. Once we get past this first row, it will get much easier. But again, we're just doing knit stitches, so we're bringing a loop from the back through the front of the loop on our foundation and do that all the way across. So we just have a few more loops here to complete on our foundation, continuing to do the knit stitch all the way down, pulling the next loop from our working yarn through the next loop on our foundation. And this is what it should look like when you're done. Like I said, the foundation row can be a little bit fiddly, so you can pull those loops up if it makes you feel a little bit more comfortable. And now we're going to call these the live loops. So as we continue through our project, I'm going to reference the live loops, and that's the stitches that we've already knitted on our project. Now to move on to the next row. So we're going to bring the next loop on our working yarn through the next loop on our live project, right from front to back like we did before. No need to turn your work, no need to make any adjustments. Jump right back into the following row. So now that you see how we move on to next rows, just know that we're going to complete this block until we have 16 total rows. Once you have your 16 rows, meet me back here. We're going to bind off this block and move on to our next block. So I've completed all of my rows. I'm just on my last couple stitches of row 16, and then I'll be ready to bind off. So starting on the right hand side of my work, I'm going to take my first loop and my second loop, push my second loop through the first, from the back to the front. Now my next loop, from back to the front, push it through, next loop, back to front, and push it through. We're going to get these nice little V's on the top. We're going to need those later, so it's important to do this neatly. But you're just going to continue binding off in this way until you get to the end of your work. Just a couple more stitches here. We're going to make sure we bind off all of our stitches. Just one more. And now that we have our final loop, we're going to rotate our work to work along the edge of our first block to start working on our second block. So when we look down the side of our first block, we have these little V's that we're going to work into. Each of those V's is a row. We had 16 rows, but we need to get back to 24 stitches. To do that, we're going to increase 1 stitch for every other row. So to start, we're going to bring the next loop of our working yarn through the same loop that our live loop is in. So it's turned it from 1 to 2 stitches in that loop. Bring the next loop of your working yarn through the loop on your next row. Now we're going to bring 2 loops through the next row. So here's 1 loop and another loop. 1 loop through the next row, 2 loops through the following row. 1 loop through the next row, and 2 loops through the following row. And this is what we're going to do all the way down until we've worked each of our 16 rows, and we'll have 24 stitches at the end. From here, we'll just want to continue our knit stitches just like we did on the first block, and we're going to be working 16 total rows. Now, as you can see, I'm starting to get towards the end of my first ball of yarn here at the end of this row. So I'll just want to work until I have 1 or 2 loops left and get ready to change to my next ball of yarn. So in this case, I had 1 loop left. I'm going to cut the little string that's connecting that loop. And it's perfect that I'm at the end of a row because now I can just start my next row with my new ball of yarn. So I'm going to grab that ball, take the label off, find the end, skip the first 2 loops because those will be my ends, and then take that 3rd loop and start my knit stitches up again. Just keep going, just like I never stopped. I'm just going to keep knitting until I have 16 total rows, and then I'll be ready to bind off. So join me back here when you're ready to bind off, and then we'll move on to block 3. So now we're ready to bind off after our 16 rows. The only difference here is that our bind off is going to start on the left, and just like normal, we're going to push the 2nd loop through the 1st, 2nd loop through the 1st, 2nd loop through the 1st. And we're going to complete that all the way across the row until we've bound off all of our stitches. Now we're coming towards the end. We're going to grab that last loop, bind that off. We've got our live loop, and we're going to rotate to work along the ends of block 2. Again, we have 16 rows, and we're going to need to get to 24. We've got some loops here. We're just going to need to weave those in later, so we'll just pretend those don't exist right now. But we're going to be working into the ends of our rows. So our first loop we're going to leave by itself. I'm going to bring 2 loops through the next row. And then we're going to bring up 1 loop in the following row. Just through that back loop there, from back to front through that row. 2 loops through the following row. So there's 1 and 2. Again, 1 loop in the next row. 2 loops in the row after that. And we're going to repeat that all the way down the row. By the time we come to the end, we're going to have 24 total loops. And again, we're going to knit 16 rows and bind off. Go ahead and do all of that just like we've done before. Meet me back here, and we're going to move on to our last block. My 3rd block is now complete and bound off. I'm going to just do a quick count to make sure I've got my number of rows to work into the ends of block 3. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. Perfect. So I did need to start with a new ball of yarn for block 4. So I'm going to skip that first loop to make it my end and go with the next loop. I'm going to pull up that loop in my first row, just the 1 loop here, and pull up 2 loops in my next row. There's 1, 2 right in that same loop, 1 in the next row, 2 in the following row. Just in that back loop, 1, and here comes 2. So I'm going to repeat that down. So 1 in the next row, 2 in the next. Do that and then meet me towards the end of the row, and we're going to seamlessly join this to our first block. I've got just a couple stitches to go here. And for my last stitch, I need to increase. So the first loop is going to go through that end just like normal. Now for the next loop, I'm going to find the row on block 1. And I'm going to bring that loop through that row first. So here's that loop. Bring the loop through that row. And then also bring it through the last stitch on block 4. And that constitutes our increase, 2 loops through that stitch. So let's do a quick count just to make sure we've got all of our loops accounted for. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Awesome. Now we're ready to start working the opposite way. We're going to find the next loop on our working yarn, and we'll need to work it through 2 rows on our first block. So we're going to find the next 2 rows on our first block. There's 1 and 2. Bring the loop from the back to the front through the first of those rows, and then from the back to the front on the next row as well. Lastly, with that same loop, we're going to bring it through the next live loop on block 4. And now we're ready to start working back across the row like we've done before. Next working through loop through next live loop, loop through loop, loop through loop, just like that. So now we've established those first 2 rows on block 4. From now on, we'll have 24 loops, which is what we need. So our join to block 1 is going to look a little bit different for subsequent rows. So join me here when you get towards the end of a row that goes from left to right, and I'll show you what our join to block 1 looks like from here on out. Back at the end of my row, just a couple more stitches till the end. And for my last stitch, I need to bring my working loop through the next row on row 1 first. So I'm going to find that row, go through that back loop, and then bring that loop through my stitch. Now for my next loop, I need to connect it to the next 2 rows on block 1. So back to front through the first row, back to front through the next row, and then back to front through the first stitch to head back the opposite direction. And now I'm ready to go back to my knit stitching. And you're going to repeat that all the way up the row, all the way up this block rather, and you'll have 16 total rows when you get towards the end. Once you get to the end, meet me there, we'll bind off together and I'll show you how we'll weave in our ends. Here I am just at my last few stitches on the end of my 4th block. After my last stitch is done, I'll want to count up 2 loops and then snip the space between the 2nd and 3rd loop, because that will be the end of my project. And now I'm ready to bind off. I'm going to start from my right edge, 2nd loop through the 1st loop, 2nd through the 1st, just like we've been binding off before, but this is the last bind off for our project. And once I get to that last stitch, oh, one too many, there we go. I've finished that last stitch, so now I'm going to cut the threads between those last 2 loops that are going to be my ends. There's 1, and the 2nd loop makes 2. And then I'm going to take my tail, put it through my working loop, and then pull that up and out of my project. And that's it. All of my knit stitches are done. We now have a beautiful backdrop. We do have a couple finishing steps to do, and then this will be machine washable. You can even put a little bit of steam on this to flatten out any edges that might be curling. You can do that with a garment steeper or even with a steam iron. So now we're going to flip our project over, and I'll show you how we're going to weave in our ends. You're just going to grab any one of your tails and start working it through the bumps in the back of your project. Just with your finger, you don't need any special tools to do this. Just work it through a few of the bumps on the back of your project And once you've woven it in enough, you can then cut the end and you will be completely done. You will have a gorgeous backdrop that you'll be able to use for ages. You can always go get more yarn, make this in more pretty colors as well. I want to thank you so much for hanging out with me for this tutorial. If you do decide to make one of these loop yarn backdrops and use it for photos on Instagram or Facebook, please do tag at TL Yarn Crafts. I would absolutely love to see it. That's it for today, loves. I will see you next time.